you.
And it's a pleasure and honor to have you.
Thank you.
And the purpose of meeting up with you is to leave something for the posterity of your experience. I think you're just one year short of your service there. I think you entered your service in 1964.
Yes.
And we want to capture your experience in terms of the evolution of Indian economic policy as well as developmental policies that you will see.
Well, it's a very fair question. I should have written about it. I'm still contemplating writing about it, gathering the material, writing about it. Two publishers who are keen. HarperCollins is very keen,
so we have to
do it. And they have even given the caption for it, which is Portraits of Power. But to talk of the evolution of the Indian economy from the time when I entered the service is a fascinating subject. Please let's not forget that in the initial years after India's independence, not only because of the somewhat Fabian socialist background of the people who led the India's freedom movement, which really gave the economic strategy in its earlier years a somewhat Fabian socialist slant. Late Jawaharlal Nehru was greatly influenced by many of these nascent socialist ideas at that particular point in time. Not only because of that, but more importantly, immediately after India's political independence, India faced a huge problem of shortage of food grains. It also faced a huge problem of the shortage of foreign exchange. So the strategy of planning was a strategy of being autarkic, was motivated very greatly by a psychology of fear that we should not really, having got political independence, now begin to lose our economic independence, which could impinge on our political independence very significantly. And I think that if we look at the structure, therefore, of the Indian economy in the very early years of India's independence, I mean, the first 5-year plan was, of course, a holding operation. But the second 5-year plan, which got the imprint of the late P.C. Mahalanobis, look at the Mahalanobis model of planning. A lot of it is a planning not for an integrated world. It is a planning for a more autarkic world, in which basically we need to produce the mother capital goods, which produces mother capital goods, and the emphasis is on large capital-intensive investments, which would guarantee India a degree of economic independence. So I think that the initial years, 64 when I joined the service, was of an India which was seeking to preserve and conserve its economic independence without really becoming too dependent. In the process, of course, as policies evolved, you know that we suffered terrific shortage of food grains. And I think that not only we ended up depending on a degree of foreign assistance, which subsequently came to be known as the great PL 480 era, where it was some ship with the mouth, it became a common expression. And it's difficult to think of an India which was so dependent for its food grains on external imports and external aid, because it did not have also foreign exchange to be able to pay for it. And the PL 480 account, which was created for purposes of enabling us not to really have a cycle of great starvation of food grains, is a product of that. So that was the kind of India which was in 64. It was also an India which was just beginning to craft out its agricultural strategy in terms of improving the reach of irrigation, improving the productivity of the soil, in trying to build infrastructure which would be credible, and of course deal with the terrific problem of huge amount of poverty which existed on the number of percentage of people who were below any kind of poverty line which you would draw. This was the India of the 60s, which continued on the 70s. I'll stop here for the subsequent period.
Yes. I think largely, especially international press, the economists they have done an India report 2 years ago, and what they have said is that Indian economic policy that have been pursued between 1947 till about 1991 they're more of regressive policies. I think they have policies in one sense, they put the Indian economic growth rate almost about maybe 3-4% behind. And because India at that point of time was supposed to be following what's called as Hindu rate of growth, which is just about 3.5% and things like that. So while maybe if you look at 1947, countries which were born then, especially like Japan, South Korea, Finland and all this, they have taken a good route and they have prospered. Whereas India, around the same time, because if you look at 1947 to 91, I think we have followed this Hindu rate of growth, and therefore did our policies have become regressive, and therefore we had lost, or in other words, maybe did we miss the bus in terms of economic growth rates?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is the way in which the economist has looked at it, which you have mentioned. But if you look at it from other point of view, I mean, perhaps the real problem really became from the mid-60s. Because up to the 60s, if you look at our rates of growth and if you look at our GDP, it is more or less comparable with what the Chinese had achieved. It was certainly better than many other emerging markets, even though, as I mentioned to you, that there were these terrific problems of adequacy of agriculture, adequacy of food grains, the great problem of foreign exchange, the high density of poverty, the very poor infrastructure, all this was there. But the big divergences began to take place from the mid-60s. Because the rest of Asia had begun to correct kind of a course correction. And therefore the rest of Asia was beginning to go into kind of an economic strategy which really was designed to improve productivity of capital and labor, total factor productivity, improvement in incremental capital output ratio. But we did not correct our policies from the mid-60s. And if you look at time series data, it is from that time onwards that the divergences really begin to become sharper and more accentuated.
So, because when you look at, because normally...
And the Hindu rate of growth that you mentioned about, the word coined by my late teacher, Professor Raj Krishna, from whom I had the privilege of being taught in the Delhi School of Economics, as indeed I had the privilege of having been taught both by Amartya and Jagdish, both of whom were contemporaries, teaching at the Delhi School of Economics at that time, which was quite a center of economic excellence. Now this Hindu rate of growth was really suggesting that with that kind of an investment ratio and that kind of the savings ratio, and given the poverty it was not possible to improve the savings ratio, with that kind of a rate of growth, we were crawling along at between about 3% or so. And I think that the cutoff years of 91 perhaps would be an exaggeration, because some degree of, or a significant degree of course correction had begun to take place in the 1980s also. And I think that people regard that to be a first bout of economic reforms of 1980, when many of the hurdles in terms of capacity constraints and so on were removed. You had access to better technology, you had begun to take a little different view on foreign capital and foreign investment. So you did get a change from the Hindu rate of growth in the 80s. Of course, it was not significant enough till, of course, we hit the great problem of 1991. We had gone to the International Monetary Fund earlier than 1991. But I think that the 1991, in a certain sense, begins to represent a watershed year in more ways than one. Because, of course, it is debatable why 1991, what led to 1991, since we had endemic foreign exchange problems earlier. Perhaps if you look at, I think there are two other contributory factors, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, the war in the Middle East, and the decline in the remittance values. I think these three exasperated and left India little choice but to take recourse to large accommodation by both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and also to undertake far-reaching reforms particularly on trade and industry, which would improve productivity, bump up the rates of growth, and significantly enhance our exports, therefore our ability to pay for within scalable imports.
So coming back to the 80s, I think there's some interesting fact, I'm sure we should all be proud of that one, because I think it is during your tenureship in Tokyo that, I think India started really looking forward or looking outward for creating good in companies. I think it's again during your tenureship in Tokyo that the Maruti Suzuki thing has taken place. So what was the whole thing behind that? Why?
Well, if you recall that in an earlier period also, the need for India to modernize was something that late Indira Gandhi ji wanted to do, and as a very important symbolic significance was the automobile sector. And late Mr. Sanjay Gandhi, had tried to have a collaboration with Renault, the French company, which had not really proved very successful. Sanjay ji unfortunately passed away in a tragic accident. And when Rajiv ji had begun to therefore assume a little more important role in advising Mrs. Gandhi, one of the things Mrs. Gandhi felt that we must look to the East, we must look to Japan, we must look to the newer models of countries which have been successful after the war. And when I did go to Japan, one of the mandates which I had from the Prime Minister was to try and seek an important automobile collaboration. Frankly, Suzuki was not my first choice because when I went to Japan, I found that perhaps Suzuki's name in Japan was of a small motorcycle manufacturer. It had very small cars. It was even the motorcycle, it was nowhere compared to Honda, for instance. And of course, as far as automobiles are concerned, there were bigger names like Toyota and Nissan. Now, the car which had really personally had my fancy was a car called Subaru, because the manufacturers of Subaru were the ones who had manufactured the Zero engine in the war, which the Japanese had used very aggressively. And the precision, the factory that I visited, demonstrated they had achieved high degree of technological excellence. And I felt that since they were not producing Zero aircrafts now, perhaps Subaru was the most sought after small mid-sized cars. But by then, of course, considerable headway had also been made by Suzuki. I visited the factory in Hamamatsu, and we had to make a decision. And the decision was also partly promoted by the Japanese, because think of a world of that time when I went. I mean, it was one of the fixation of the world that India and Pakistan were being thought of on the same level. And because Suzuki had gone to Pakistan, the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry, the famous MITI as they call it, was really giving a guidance that India was suitable for getting Suzuki. So I think that taking all circumstances, and we had little time to waste, we went in for the collaboration with Suzuki, which has proved very successful. It transformed dramatically India's automobiles sector, which has its own upstream and downstream implications. And once that began, now of course all other Japanese companies also wanted to look at the growing Indian market. But at a time when our policies had begun to become more accommodative, the purchasing power had become significant enough for people to go in for a low-end car themselves. Because if today we see every automobile, let's not forget this is the product of per capita income and people's purchasing power having gone up dramatically, having experienced rates of growth as high as 9% for 4 successive years. And if you look at the time series data, the last 20 years after 1991 have meant a very significant change in the economic landscape.
Okay. So now let's come back to the economic planning that happens at the state levels. Now, I think in your own experience you would have seen some states progressing very decisively, and some states, even though they are endowed with great resources, but they are not progressing at all. And they, in fact, maybe, I mean, again, something to do with economic policy making there, or in the political leadership there. But then, at the end of the day, all that we, I mean, somebody like you who are at the head of affairs who are looking at is, what kind of economic indicators are we going to leave it for the posterity?
Very important question. It's an important question because I have recently grappled with this question. My last book, released 2 months ago, which was jointly edited by Lord Nicholas Stern of the London School of Economics, and currently President of the British Academy, and myself, is entitled New Bihar, Rekindling Governance and Development. very happy to provide you with a copy of that. I was privileged that this book was released by the Honorable President in a special function of the Rajya 2 months ago, and where Amartya Sen, who is one of the contributors to this book, was also present along with many others who have contributed to this. Now the theme is exactly this, that Bihar was a basket case. Till about 7-8 years ago, it was an example of the withering away of the state.
It was always a misgovernance.
And Dr. Manmohan Singh, as finance minister, and I had the privilege of working as the finance secretary with Dr. Manmohan Singh for 5 years, from 91 to 96 at the time of the Transparency crisis. He used to often joke with me that India will begin to prosper when Bihar prospers, which was a tongue-in-cheek remark because he never believed that Bihar could ever get out of the basket case. And yet I think that 7 years of improved governance gave Bihar a rate of growth of 11.8%. I was privileged to be, when Nitish Kumar came to power 7-8 years ago, I was privileged before I joined politics in the Rajya Sabha to be the chairman and deputy vice chairman of the Bihar State Planning Board, which laid down the contours of the Bihar's 11th 5-year plan strategy after a long time. So I think that directions were given, and I think that 3 important components are very important. See, let's not forget that India is, in the constitution, chosen the path of fiscal federalism. I mean, it is a federation of states with a unitary bias, but I think that the states are the most important part of the India's growth story, because unlike many other countries, their constitutional forefathers viewed this to be a working federation. So states which have got, or which have received, or which have benefited from good governance have really managed to attract private flows. And states which have not, did not get private flows. One of the reasons why Bihar was left behind was, or the eastern part of India was left behind. And people have often used this word Bimaru to represent the states which have got lagged behind in the governance matrix. Primarily arose out of the failures of governance, primarily arose in the inability to adapt policies to garner private investment. And in the process, while the rest of India, which had better governance, marched ahead, these states really, I think, lagged behind. One of the remarkable growth stories of the last 7-8 years has been that some of the more better governed states have begun to languish, and the Bimaru states has shed off their Bimaru label and have shown rates of growth which are demonstrably higher than some of the other states which are growing much faster. Of course, they have a long way to go because they have begun from a much lower base and they have begun with many problems being compounded. But I think the 3 key ingredients, I think, that which matters. First, I think what matters is, in my view, is terrifically important, is expectations. And when John Maynard Keynes wrote greatly about the general theory on expectations, how do you view the future? Do you view the future pessimistically, or do you view the future optimistically? If the future looks optimistic, then you take many decisions, which are micro decisions in your own life, in terms of what you wish to do in your planning, to take decisions on investment, buy a house, buy a property, take a new project. And I believe that micro decisions, when aggregated, alter the macro picture. And for that, I think expectations to be changed is the quality of governance and, of course, the kind of law and order. Do you give and guarantee to the people security of life and property, which I regard as the principal and most key function of any sovereign state, the security of life and property? Is the priorities of planning correct? Namely physical and social infrastructure, importance to health, importance to education is terrifically important. I subscribe to the view of Amartya Sen and his new latest book, which is lying on my table, India an Uncertain Glory. Uncertain glory because I think that growth alone is not very important. Whom has growth benefited is important. I also have that lovely book of on my table of Jagdish Bhagwati, in which he has argued why growth matters. Well, actually, frankly, I think that this is both are important. You cannot have without growth you cannot have the resources which you have put into education. But you can have the resource and not put into education and health. And social indicators of growth can continue to be very terrible. So a more integrated view of growth and growth quality becomes exceedingly important. So I think that the priority of the state in terms of the nature of growth patterns becomes exceedingly important. And third is, do you create a physical infrastructure ensuring a degree of minimum supply of energy, which will make private investment a gainful activity? Do you or do you not in today's world begin to foster policies which will improve total factor productivity in terms of the productivity of capital and labor, and begin to therefore build the virtuous circles from higher rates of saving and higher rates of investment? Now if you look at really the data, these states which are laggard states have really addressed these three critical components which I have mentioned, and that's how they have shot ahead. But I think that India's fiscal story, more than beyond the fiscal story, India's story of fiscal federalism, which is really evolving, will see the drama of a healthy, and I regard that as a very positive sign of competition between federal states in India to be able to garner capital, to be able to attract investment, to be able to improve, I think, the life quality. And as we go along, this will also make our democracy more mature, because as people begin to experience better life quality, better expectations, a better future, the expectations in electoral politics moves away from exclusive dependence on identity politics to development-centric politics. It is only those incumbent governments and chief ministers who deliver better roads, better education, better health, and a better future are likely to get and have the prospect of re-election than chief ministers who rely exclusively on identity politics. So I think that this evolution of our competitive fiscal federalism is also an indication of the maturity of our democratic choice patterns, and it begins to alter the psychology of electorate voters in demanding and seeking better life quality.
So now if you transpose these three principles into outlying the states, especially like northeast states, what happens to, because they're still laggards, because I'm sure even with the government focusing on these states with different packages, special packages, things like that, nothing is happening to these states. And in fact, people now say that how long will it take for them to join the mainstream, because in terms of a lot of economic indicators, including the gross, the state product and all that, they're lagging, because I'm sure in more, maybe expectation-wise, maybe in some they might be doing well, law and order, maybe they say, but then maybe when it comes to infrastructure, yes, maybe they might be lagging. So how long do you think it will take for these states to come back into the mainstream of the rest of the country? Or maybe like, Bihar, what Bihar is doing right now?
Well, I think it's a hypothetical question, which is a more important question, is that the more progressive states begin to ask themselves increasingly, how long shall we bear the burden and the cross of cross-subsidizing states which have continued, in spite of resources, to languish and remain very, very underdeveloped. Now, having said this, that there is this understandable worry of some states not catching up with the mainstream. If you look at recent data, I encourage you to read the recent report of the Rajya report, which was constituted for designing a composite development index. Many of these northeastern states were given 5 years or 10 years ago a particular kind of an economic strategy called special category states, in which they were given tax breaks and tax relief. Also, in terms of the transfers for centrally sponsored schemes, the proportionality of burden that the states would have to face for access to the resources from the centrally sponsored schemes. This was given to them, looking at their state of underdevelopment. Now, if you look at the report of the Rajya, many of these northeastern states have got now per capita income which may be higher than Bihar and maybe Odisha. Their rates of growth have been much faster. So they are beginning to catch up. And I think that I would strongly urge we shouldn't give up on hope, and we shouldn't give up on what we expect is a major turnaround. And if you look at the tables which are there in the Rajya Committee report, at lens hold that economic strategy, which is sensible, which is differential and differentiated in terms of enabling them to become part of the economic mainstream, has begun to have positive dividends, and they're catching up with the mainstream.
So I think for paucity of time, let me ask the last one question. In companies, people talk about corporate governance codes and there's complaints and things like that. Do you think at some point countries should also should have a governance code, and therefore everybody will be expected to comply with this code? So there's not so much of judgmental bias there. There's not so much of opinion bias there. There's a code that is laid out, and just we have to follow it, so that it becomes very easy.
It's an idealistic scenario, right? Because it is true that our constitution has been amended multiple times. It is also true that given the fact that India is now inevitably a part of a more integrated global economy, our trade to GDP ratio, which used to be 12-13% in 1991, is now today 42-43%, which means that India has now become that much completely integrated with part of the global economy. And therefore we need to look to global benchmarks in terms of assessing ourselves on our competitiveness index, our transparency index, our governance index. And there are very important reports which have been submitted on constitutional review. If you look at the report submitted by the former Chief Justice, Justice Venkatachalaya report on constitutional, it does address these issues, important issues of governance improvement. But I have to confess with some degree of sadness that Parliament hasn't found time and space to debate and deliberate some of these important issues. So I hope that the awareness pressures of the people in this country, the media, the civil society, the right to information, will be able to generate pressures to alter the matrix of political power, and that political parties would voluntarily begin, under the public opinion and the pressure of this opinion, to voluntarily adopt codes of conduct which would benchmark India's democracy with the best democracies in the world.
Thank you so much.